For today's recording of ASOP Afghanistan, we will be talking about prefixes. Prefixes are a group of letters that you might add in front of a word to influence or change its meaning. Here are some examples of prefixes. For each example prefix, there will be blue words, which is a good usage of prefixes, or red words, which are not good usages of prefixes because sometimes they just do not work or are not understandable without previous knowledge. Here is our first example of a prefix. The word pre is a prefix. It means before. Prehistoric means before human history, or during the time of the ages where there were dinosaurs and different types of fossilized animals. Predetermined means that it has already been determined, or it was determined before. Prevent means to do something before, to not allow something else to happen. Prepare is to do something before in order to be ready for some certain action. Here are some bad usages of this prefix pre. President is not a good prefix because it requires outside knowledge to decode its meaning. Pretty is not a good usage of the prefix pre because pretty means to be beautiful and it has its own individual meaning. It does not work with the prefix. Pregnant also is not a good way of using the word pre because it also has its own individual meaning, so the prefix does not influence its meaning. Pressure is also a bad example of using the prefix pre. Another prefix we can talk about is in. In means opposite. For example, inexpensive means the opposite of expensive, or cheap. Indecisive means the opposite of decisive, or not decisive, or taking a long time to make a decision. Invisible means the opposite of being visible, which is not visible, so you cannot see an invisible thing. Indestructible means opposite of being destructible or easy to destroy, which is indestructible, which is much harder to destroy. Industry is a bad way to use the prefix in because it requires outside context. Incident is also a bad way to use the prefix in because incident means a certain situation that has happened. Indicate is also a bad way to use the prefix in because it does not have any influence on the word, and indicate is to show or to point at. Insect is also a bad way to use the prefix in because insect requires some outside knowledge. Another prefix we can see here is un, which means not. Some examples of this are unhappy, which means not happy. Another example of this is unsuccessful, which means not successful. Another example is unwind, which means to relax, or to not wind or do work from the previous day. Another example is unlock, which means to not lock, which means to open. As you can see, the definition of the blue words are directly influenced by the prefix. Some bad examples of un is unique, because uni is its own prefix. and it also requires some etymology. Another example is understand, which has its own individual meaning and is not affected by understand. Another example is unicycle, which means one cycle, and uni is its own prefix. Therefore, unicycle is a bad usage of the prefix un. Another example is under, and under has its own meaning and requires outside etymology. The last example of a prefix we will go over today is this, which means reverse. Disagree is an example of the prefix dis, as it means reverse agreeing or not agreeing. Disapprove is another example, which means to not approve or reversing its approval. Another example would be dislike, which means to not like, or the reverse of being liked, which is not liking. Disconnect means the reverse of being connected, which is not connected. Some bad examples of the usage of the prefix this is distance, because distance has its own individual meaning. Disgust, because disgust is not affected by the prefix dis, and so isn't the next word, which is disdain. Dissect also is not affected by the meaning of the prefix, which means reverse, as it means to take apart. This is the end of the prefix section of Aesop grammar.